Trade Union League, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, the National Consumers League. I mean, there were 17 organizations to which Eleanor Roosevelt lent her incredible energy.
Initially, FDR wanted Eleanor to abandon her career and assume the role of White House hostess. But she quickly convinced him that she could become his roving ambassador, travel across the breadth of the nation, reporting back on conditions ordinary Americans faced during the darkest years of the Great Depression.
She created what they called the Eleanor basket, which would be right by his bed at nighttime, and she would send him in memos in which she would write out the stories that she wanted him to hear, which would then impact his policy. After a while, however, there were so many memos coming into him that he made a deal with her. Eleanor, 3 memos a night. I promise I will read them and act upon them by morning.
Eleanor Roosevelt would often travel into the Deep South. This was an alien world for the daughter of a New York aristocrat. What she found in this segregated society appalled her. She came to view race relations in America as a litmus test for the conscience of the nation, and she found that there was abundant evidence that the country was failing that test. In over 100 cases from 1933 to 1939, the Ku Klux Klan had inflicted their own perverted form of justice and retribution.
These murders included drowning, choking, stabbing, beating, torturing, maiming, skinning victims. The thousands of people gathered to watch the ritual murder of other people across the color line. They actually bought souvenirs, and the souvenirs were pieces of charred bodies.
Yet Roosevelt remained reluctant to intervene. His critics sensed a troubling detachment, evidence of a politician unwilling to expend political capital by denouncing the reality of these crimes.
I think it's conceivable that he could have lived in Georgia all those years and chosen not to be aware of what the other side of the world was like, what the other side of life in Georgia was like. But that was a choice.
But Eleanor had no hesitation in becoming involved. Appalled, she was more than ever determined to persuade FDR to press for congressional passage of an anti-lynching bill that had been stalled in the Senate for over 4 years. She took Walter White, the executive director of the NAACP, to the Oval Office to try and stir the conscience of a reluctant president.
Franklin said to him, "You go ahead, you do everything you can do. Whatever you can get done is okay with me. But I just cannot put this on my must list because I have to have the Southern votes for a rearmament." And I said to him afterwards, "Well, now what about me? Do you mind if I say what I think?" And he said, "No, certainly not. You can say anything you want. I can always say, well, that's my wife. I can't do anything about her."
FDR was reluctant to move on the race question because he knew he would be expending precious political capital on a lost cause. But when the bill finally reached the Senate floor, the First Lady's fierce advocacy stood in sharp contrast to her husband's silence.
But when he refuses to put the full pressure of the White House behind the lynching legislation, Eleanor swings into action. She not only writes about it, she, against his wishes, attends a photographic exhibit on lynching. She sits for days throughout the entire filibuster in the United States Senate as this is going on. She sits with African Americans, and the press asks her, "Mrs. Roosevelt, what are you doing?" She says, "I am bearing witness."
The anti-lynching bill was never brought to a vote. On February 21st, 1938, after a 6-week Senate filibuster, led by Southern Democrats, the White House withdrew the legislation. For those who saw this as a litmus test for Roosevelt's moral leadership, the defeat of the anti-lynching bill stands as a permanent stain on his reputation.
I don't think he's a great president because I measure greatness by the willingness of a person to stand up at the important moral moments, the moral challenges, and face them boldly. And so I'm conflicted on Roosevelt. I think that Roosevelt's presidency is transformative, it's revolutionary, but it's also deeply disappointing on the question of making the United States a better nation, a fairer nation, and a more just nation.
But Eleanor wasn't willing to accept defeat and move on. By now, she knew the power of symbolic protest. When the Daughters of the American Revolution refused to allow the classical vocalist Marian Anderson to sing at Constitution Hall, Eleanor resigned from the organization and arranged a concert on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. For the 75,000 present that day, it was a clarion call to arms, the beginning of a movement that would stretch down through time from Washington to Montgomery, to Albany, Selma, Birmingham, and beyond. But domestic concerns would end up taking a back seat to international issues in 1940 during FDR's unprecedented third run for the presidency. Franklin Roosevelt was first elected president the same year Adolf Hitler became the German chancellor. As FDR grappled with the American Depression in 1933, Hitler blamed Germany's economic woes on Jews, intellectuals, and the legacy of World War I. He insisted on restoring his nation's former greatness, whatever the cost, and regardless of the protestations of his neighbors. His bellicosity echoed across the Atlantic to an American president woefully conscious of the inadequacy of American defenses.
Roosevelt embarked on a long-term campaign of education of the American public, including the Congress, as to just how dangerous the international environment was becoming. Roosevelt knew when he embarked on this campaign that it was going to take a long time and he was going to have to proceed very slowly and very carefully.
In March of 1938, Hitler expanded the Third Reich into Austria, and 6 months later into the Sudetenland on the German border with Czechoslovakia. Then, in April 1939, Roosevelt wrote a letter to the German chancellor. In it, he listed 31 countries and asked for assurances that Germany would not attack or invade any of them for the next 10 years. 2 weeks later, Hitler issued a scathing response in an address to the Reichstag, ridiculing Roosevelt and refusing to meet his demands.
Bulgarien, Türkei, Iraq, Arabien, Syrien, Palestina, Egypt.
In June 1939, in an unprecedented show of solidarity, Roosevelt invited the King and Queen of England to visit America.
When the King and Queen of England came to see us at Hyde Park in 1939, we decided we would try to give them as much of an American entertainment as we could, and we had a picnic. The King and Queen enjoyed themselves enormously. The entertainment was given by American Indians, and as far as I know, they had a very good time. The only drawback was that the Queen found she could not eat a hot dog. Her mouth was too small.
As they prepared to leave, the president called after them, "Good luck to you. All the luck in the world." Three months later, Germany moved across the Polish border, plunging the continent into war. FDR received the news in his office at Hyde Park. It confirmed his worst fears.
This nation will remain a neutral nation, but I cannot ask that every American remain neutral in thought as well. I hope the United States will keep out of this war. I believe that it will, and I give you assurance and reassurance that every effort of your government will be directed toward that end.
In London, one man knew that continued American neutrality would ensure German hegemony over the continent of Europe. As First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill argued that Britain and the United States needed to forge a grand alliance to confront tyranny with force. His plea appeared to touch a responsive chord with Roosevelt.
On September 11th, 1939, he sat down and wrote a personal letter to Churchill, of course, who wasn't even prime minister at that point, offering to open a channel of communication, and almost surely understood that he couldn't stay out of the